Yeah. All right. So we're recording now. Starting a little late on this recording, but nobody has missed anything. So we're kind of framing the discussion on what are we going to be focusing on within the technology realm, and we're just starting by defining technology, and that's a broad definition. So we don't want to think that technology is always computer chips. And so in sports technologies, there's different kinds, and I want to work through a few of them, and then you can think about some of the parallels that might be in esports along the way. So one of the kinds of technologies that are technologies that change or enable a change in how we move. How, in other words, a technique. They may enable a different technique or enable a different technique to be developed. So I've given you three examples here in pictures. If you start on the left, what you see is a fairly low-tech technology, but it turns out to be very important in certain sports, and that is just what we call in Norwegian the sjukas, right? Which, believe it or not, those didn't always exist. So if you go back before, say, mid-60s, people who did the high jump or the pole vault, they would have been landing in sawdust. You know what I mean by sawdust? So it was soft, but not that soft. And so if you landed wrong, it still was pretty painful. So that kind of put a limit on how people jumped, and they mostly wanted to land either on their feet or at least on their butt or back or something like that. You certainly didn't want to land on your head. But when this padding came, then it facilitated a different technique, which we'll see was called the Fosbury flop. Dick Fosbury, he figured it out in high school, 16, 17 years old, kept developing it, and wins the gold medal in the 1968 Olympics with a flop where he's going over the bar backwards with his head first, his back to the bar, and he's landing on his neck. And you're not going to do that unless you can land on something reasonably soft and not break your neck or get hurt. So that was an enabling technology. The one in the middle, we all from Norway know fairly well, although we did not have anything to do with inventing it in Norway. In fact, they fought it tooth and nail, as they always do in winter sports technologies. But it was the clap skate, which was the only technology that I'm aware of in sports where the sports scientists led the way, where they actually said this will be better, and then convinced athletes to use it. And it was hard. I know the guy who was involved. He did his PhD on the development of the clap skate. His advisor, a guy named von Ingenschenau from Amsterdam, they knew that this had been patented. This idea of a hinged skate had been patented 100 years before. But manufacturing it just wasn't possible. It wasn't feasible to build the skate that could actually tolerate the forces and work. And so when they started building it, there was no patent, there was no real way to make a whole lot of money on it. So anyway, it spread very quickly. Once they convinced the athletes, they did an experiment on junior athletes. Half the junior athletes used regular skates. Half the junior athletes got the new clap skates. They just let them skate the whole season. And the skaters that had the clap skates just got better. They got faster, more than the others. And so then the senior athletes said, okay, we want these. In Nagano Olympics 1998, if you didn't have the clap skates, you didn't have a chance. You weren't in the medals. And so now it's standard equipment. Now, the third example there is of course, just grooming of the snow, of creating the nice tracks or spoor. And that really started, if anybody knows, you Norwegians, who knows when that started? Nobody? It started long ago, but it was in the Squaw Valley Olympics in 1960 that they started with a kind of a prepping a machine that could actually lay down decent tracks. And that had a huge impact. And so one of the things that ultimately happened out of that was that Bill Koch was able to develop this kind of half skating technique initially, where he had one foot in the track and then one foot skating. And he was an American, and he wasn't as good as the best Norwegians in the classic style. So he figures out a different technique, and then he beats them all, and he wins the World Cup. And then, of course, they go over to full skating. But that again was enabled by better prepping of the courses, so that now the athletes could develop a more, you might say, a more nuanced technique. So these are examples of technologies that change how we move. Now, another example, or this is to show the progression of the Fosbury. You had these different techniques, and all of these, this almost looks like he's contorting himself, but all of these, the head had to be kind of landing after the body, whereas here, the flop, he would end up landing basically on his neck and shoulders, and that's still the way the flop happens. So another kind of technology that involves in sports is technologies that improve what we might call movement effectiveness or efficiency. And to understand what I mean by that, you have to think about that anytime you're moving, if you're a sprinter or a cyclist or you're running up a hill, then you have to generate what we call external power. You have to turn that muscular work, which is internal. It has to result in muscle contractions and feet pushing against the ground and movement and power output that results in an acceleration of the body. But that's on the one side, and we can get bigger and stronger, more powerful, and so forth. But then on the other side of the equation, there will always be what we call power losses, friction, air resistance, movement of whatever's under the surface we're moving or running on, sound waves. All of these things represent loss of power to the environment. And so what's left, is what you actually are able to use that moves your body or accelerates your body. And obviously we want that acceleration part to be as big as possible, and we want the losses to be as small as possible. And part of controlling the losses are good technique in any movement, whether you're jumping or riding a bike and trying to be aerodynamic, or skating, you're trying to minimize the loss of power and make sure it's all going where you want it to go, either put whatever you're pushing against or so forth. And so this is a constant, an equation that kind of every sport can think about this equation, or can be defined in terms of this equation at some level, right? And so when you're a beginner, it's more important to think about the left side of the equation, just learning how to do the sport, learning how to generate power, getting bigger, getting stronger, getting more endurance. But as you get better and better, what we end up seeing is that you start having, there's only so much you can do on the output side. You can only get so powerful. And so you start looking for ways to cheat the system or reduce your losses with technology, with technique, either technique or technology. And they often are kind of connected. Does that make sense? Right? So you kind of, it ends up being cheaper to get a little bit more aerodynamic on the bike than it is to get 20 watts more powerful if you've already been training for 10 years. So these are the kinds of things we start seeing, is more and more just looking for what they're often called marginal gains in the sports lingo. Now, what are some examples? Well, of course, cycling is a good example. This whole aerodynamics thing that it started around 1986 or 80, was it 86 or 89? Maybe it was 89. It was a Tour de France. It was Greg LeMond, American athlete. He was 50 seconds behind in the Tour de France in the last stage or etapa. It was a time trial, and he, for the first time, used what you see there, which are aero bars. crude first, the very first iteration of the aero bars and kind of getting down in a good position, wearing a fairly sleek helmet and so forth. And his main opponent, the French rider named Fignon, was basically just riding in the standard position. And he got beat by 58 seconds in that particular race and 8 seconds in the overall Tour de France. 8 seconds is pretty damn small margin in a 21-day race. And the French rider was never the same. It pretty much ended his career. But that was the start of the aerodynamic revolution. And now it's just, if you don't spend tens of thousands of euro on testing and equipment and that, you really don't have a chance at the highest levels of performance in that particular event in time trialing, because it is so important to be aerodynamic. Now, the picture in the middle, those are the shoes, or at least the type of shoe. I've had one of the exact shoes that Karsten Warholm wore when he set the world record. And they were developed for him, with his coach. One of the big issues on those is the carbon fiber plate that you can see under the shoe, which made it more stiff, which then reduced power losses in every step. So he gets better rebound or better transfer back to his feet. When he hits the ground, he gets a better return of force. And so I've talked to his coach and they said, yeah, the shoes were part of the world record. They were part of the difference that was generated that helped him break the world record. But he had to train specifically to be even able to use the shoes, because it forced him to have a little bit different technique. He had to be strong enough in his ankles and his calves and in the feet to even handle the shoes, because they were so darn stiff. So that's another, so again, it's an example that the technology can help improve, but then the athlete has to almost adapt their body to the technology. And in this case, Rai Benjamin, I'm sorry, the guy who he beat for the world record, he also had I believe it was Adidas, his shoe, or maybe it was Nike, but anyway, he also had a very similar type of development in his shoe. But in the shoe wars, maybe Warholm won that particular battle. And then the third example here you see is golf ball. I don't know how many of you have played golf, but it is a sport that you can spend an incredible amount of money on if you're a bad golfer or a good golfer, always in search of better equipment that will help you hit the ball harder, faster, longer. But the golf ball itself has had an evolution. And one of the fundamental aspects of the golf ball, which it may seem a little bit counterintuitive if you don't know the physics of aerodynamics, but that a smooth golf ball actually has more air resistance, because it creates this turbulent wave behind the ball, because the air kind of sticks to the front boundary of the ball and then gets moved around, and you get this big suction or vortex behind it. So a smooth ball doesn't move nearly as far through the air when it's hit by a golf club, even if it's the exact same weight and everything, same size and weight. A smooth surface golf ball will travel 100 meters. And this dimpling will break up the air resistance and create a much less of a boundary layer and less of this suction effect. And this ball will travel 3 times as far, just because of that dimpling. But of course, we didn't always know that, or golfers didn't know that. The first golf balls, were of course made of wood from the 1600s. And then along the way came the feather golf ball, which was basically taking goose feathers, packing them just as darn tight as they could, and then wrapping around it leather, wet leather, that the wind would dry and kind of contract and create this golf ball. And then the next came, it's a kind of a rubber tree resin that was used. And then they started just kind of, by accident, they figured out this issue of the smooth versus rough, and they started just drawing or scraping lines in the ball to try to create that rough surface. And then they found out, the dimpling came. So the golf ball that we kind of basically see today has its roots in about over 100 years ago. So this is 400 years ago. Golf's been around a long time. And then, of course, now it's composite materials, and there's different levels of coefficient of restitution or bounce in the different layers that create this kind of explosiveness in the ball, so that the ball will leave the club head at a higher velocity than the club head came into the ball. So the top golfers are hitting about 300 kilometers an hour. The ball leaves the club at 300 kilometers per hour, which is pretty fast. So that's an example of the technologies that make you more efficient or decrease various power losses to friction, wind resistance, and so forth. And then we've got these biotechnologies that are probably the more, maybe quite a number of them are either illegal or highly suspicious. There's lots of issues around biotechnologies right now in sports because of various, genetic manipulation, blood doping, hormone manipulation. There's the whole spectrum. And then the sport has to make decisions regarding where the limits go, what the rules are. And that varies. But these three are examples of, you might call, legal ergogenics. And ergogenics just means anything that improves the capacity to do work, physical work. Creatine is some of you have heard of, maybe if you've been in the weight room. Some guys take creatine, and there's some evidence that for at least short events, it builds up your creatine phosphate stores. It helps, and it may help build muscle mass as well. But it has a limited application. But it has made a ton of money for the people who sell creatine. This is a newer issue, which is hydrogels. These are various products that are basically, it's a kind of a drug delivery system. It's a way of delivering carbohydrates that maybe gets it through the gut faster, because in certain sports like triathlon, cycling, where you need carbohydrate, one of the big challenges for athletes is just to get it in their stomach and out without getting sick while they're operating at a very high power output. And so they're using various technologies to try to help what they call the uptake, glucose uptake, so that what you can take in higher concentrations of carbs during a ride of these gels, and then get it out to the muscle without creating stomach problems. Because I don't know if any of you have ever competed in a sport and gotten diarrhea or a stomach problem while you're in a race. I have. It sucks. It's kind of, your body breaks down on you, and it does not feel good at all to feel like your stomach is going to explode right when you need everything to be working. So athletes are very interested in technologies, these nutritional technologies that help them to get in a lot of glucose. They measure it in grams per hour, how many grams per hour they're able to absorb, and 90, 100 is typical for these top level athletes. And so part of their training is actually learning how to eat while competing, just being able to eat enough during races. And you may be thinking, well, it's kind of, we have to also eat during a long esports, during a big competition. So there are some parallels. And then the third is, well, caffeine. Caffeine is a stimulant. It also improves fat utilization. So there's a big discussion is what's more important, the fat part or the stimulant part. It's probably the stimulant part that's most important. And it's been on the doping list before, but it's currently the concentration that will get you caught on doping for caffeine is really high now. So it's basically free for all. You can use a lot of caffeine, and it's not gonna show up as a doping positive. But it's a central stimulant. So that's an example, and I am sure there's a lot of caffeine use in esports. But it's also very popular, like in endurance sports. Towards the end of races, they will switch out from their glucose drink to something that's more caffeine oriented, just to try to give them a pickup at the end. So those are biotechnologies, and there's a lot of others. Are there any questions about this stuff? No. And then there's another area of technology that is interesting, and it's probably, I would say, it's probably the one that has been the most hype and the least real effect. I'm not sure, but that may be the case. And that's this issue of different technologies that may help recovery after training or after a hard race, whether it's a rugby match or a marathon or a long workout, a long cycling workout. And in three areas. One is so-called cryotherapy, which just means anything that involves using cold. So an ice bag on a muscle, that's a form of cryotherapy. But the most sophisticated or expensive or whatever, you have these cryotherapeutic deals where they're using temperatures like minus 150, just extremely cold for brief periods. What they want to do, the theory of it, is to get blood flow away from the skin and just to get it to all leave the skin and muscle and go into the core as much as possible, because the body's just kind of trying to survive. And then you leave the cold and you get this rebound flush with blood flow just rushing back to the muscle. And this is supposed to promote recovery. Okay. And there are some studies that support that, but it's tricky. Another example is ibuprofen, which you see, which is an anti-inflammatory or a betennelsesdämpende medicament. All of you have probably taken it at some point or another because you were either sick or you had an injury. Ibuprofen is just one example. There are other kinds. And there's been research that, athletes, that betennelses, this inflammation is something that happens after training. And so people say, well, if we can reduce inflammation, then we'll have a better performance. And then a third is, of course, massage, various forms of muscle manipulation. And the newest thing you can buy all over the place are these massage guns that pound the heck out of your muscles at a high frequency. And again, it's designed to improve recovery. The problem with all of these, or the good part is, yeah, to a certain extent, they do seem to A, reduce pain, B, maybe improve short-term ability to perform the next day kinds of things. Sometimes the data suggests, but the data also suggests that they reduce the training effect. So if you use them chronically, you don't adapt as much. So, and the reason that seems to be true is that the adaptation process for human muscle, some of the signals for that adaptation are actually those things that are causing the discomfort, the inflammation, and so forth. So they are part of the signal. And if you dampen that signal, if you put the brakes on that signal with drugs or various things, it has a short-term positive effect, but then it has a long-term negative effect on the training outcome. So you get less of an adaptation. And so nature has kind of co-opted or taking these negative signals and these molecular results, and they are both negative and positive at the same time. They're a feedback loop. Okay, so the signals of damage are also signals for adaptation, because the body is protecting itself. So there's lots of examples of that. Antioxidants like vitamin C and so forth, that they turn out to reduce the training effect if you take them every day. So the body needs to experience some of that negative response, that that damage, that inflammation and so forth, because it signals an adaptation and a start of an adaptation process. All right. So these are a mixed bag in terms of what the results seem to be. And it seems a lot of times we're kind of going against nature's own mechanisms, biochemical mechanisms for adaptation that have evolved over, tens of thousands of years. So all of those technologies are super relevant. They're part of sports. They're part of the sports ecosystem that people like me work in. And, I was just watching the tour of the Vuelta, which is Tour of Spain, a time trial. And of course, every athlete, they're using all kinds of technologies to avoid getting too hot. They're using ice vests and while they're warming up, and then they're using all the latest technologies for the aerodynamics. And it's, at the highest level of sport, it's like an exam of who's got the best technologies. But the technologies that we are going to focus on in this course that I think have more relevance to esport and to this kind of intersection of traditional sport and esport will be technologies that are designed to quantify our training, or the things we do in competitions, races, or in training, that give feedback about the process and about how we're responding to the practice or training and how we are recovering from the training. And so these are the things I work with the most because of my work with endurance sport, but they also are probably technologies that are the most relevant for deliberate practice, which is a concept that we, anybody that is trying to train specifically to be better at playing the violin or at singing or at, a certain chess, what this is called deliberate practice. You're not just playing, you are practicing, you are trying to develop your performance in various ways. And so you benefit from feedback regarding the effects of that practice, both on your technique, but also on your physiology, your stress levels, and so forth. So those are the kinds of things we're going to spend some time talking about in this course. And also the guests that I will bring in will be people who have particular expertise on one or two of these specific kinds of technologies, maybe because they've helped develop them or develop a company around them. Okay. And I'm not sure what's the time. Yeah. We'll take a break at 6. Okay. But this is kind of an interesting development, I think, is if I talked about performance development in many events where we can measure performance quite accurately, like running events or jumping or whatever, this is kind of the path we've seen, is that in the 50s, 60s, going out all the way to the 80s, you saw just dramatic performance improvements. And then it's kind of leveled off, and we're still seeing new world records, but they're pretty far between. The Carson Warholm breaking the 400-meter hurdle record in 2021, the record was from 1992. So it was almost 30 years old. And that says something about and we have another athlete in Norway, Jakob Ingebrigtsen, who's maybe he wants to try to break the 1500-meter record. Well, that record is also about the same age. It's very old now, or, it's older than some of you. And so the performances, the changes in performance have really slowed down. Why? Have the athletes gotten lazy? No, it's mostly that the athletes are now pushing the very limits of what's possible on training, and they're squeezing the limit about as tight as you can squeeze it in terms of what can be tolerated, how much muscle to mass you can develop, the power to weight ratios, tendon stress, all these things. So we're kind of at these limits in terms of training, And then meanwhile, you've got this, for many, many years, there was very little technology in sports. I can assure you, I can remember being a kid, and just the idea of measuring heart rate was huge. It was like magic, and I never had as a high school athlete, I never measured heart rate one time, because I didn't have a heart rate watch. That was just way out there. And I graduated high school in 1983. So, and then they just became, I just did a survey, and I'm going to show you some data. Almost everyone uses a heart rate monitor now. It's almost unthinkable that endurance athletes do not use one. So the technology development has gone one way, while the rate of improvement of performance is flattened out. And so now you get what you might call a hype gap. So new technologies come along, companies want to sell those technologies, that they're going to help you, make you faster, bigger, stronger, and all these things. But meanwhile, the actual change in performance is almost non-existent. So the hype is overwhelming compared to the actual effects of the newest technologies. There's just not as much to squeeze out of the lemon, and we have to be very critical. We have to be careful and not jump on the wagon too easily when people try to sell us these technologies. But the things we'll talk about, or the developments that I think are interesting, I kind of broke them into 5, and we'll focus on a few of them in this course. But one of the things that's happening is that the things that used to be you could only measure in laboratories with very sophisticated equipment, you can now measure at home. You can measure in the field. You can measure things like blood lactate and heart rate and breathing and various physiological indicators, heart rate variability, which we'll talk about, and you'll hear a speaker talk to you about. All of this stuff can be measured out, while you're sitting or while you're training or in a field. I've got almost like a little laboratory in my house. I've got my own cycling room with all these measurements I can make. So that is developed. Another development has been just putting sensors in everything. You can put a embedded sensor in a bowling ball or a tennis racket or a golf club, and then measure the movement of that object, the acceleration of that object, the peak velocity, the spin of a ball or whatever it might be, and then make decisions, or boats, or whatever. Even nowadays, if you're a Premier League football fan, you'll see that a lot of them will have catapult sensors on the back, during games, and that data is being used to do post-game analytics on how they moved, both acceleration patterns and how are they working as an individual, but also team spatial awareness. Where are they as a team, and so forth. And so all of that is possible. Then we have movement analysis. We can use video and so forth. Slow down. We can use slow motion photography. Back in the day, that was extremely hard. You had to do it by hand, each frame of a video. Now you can use an iPad and get pretty darn good movement analysis of someone doing a high jump or a pole vault or something like that. So that's visual analysis is much easier. And then of course you got data, big data analytics. And if you collect enough data on thousands of athletes, and that, you start to see patterns, or the same athlete, thousands of hours, you start to see patterns that you can make predictions from, and so forth. So we'll several of these, particularly the first one and maybe the fourth one, we'll spend some time looking at and talking about it, how they are maybe have some relevance to you, and it's useful to understand. And we're not going to spend much time on this one, this issue of I'm not going to talk about the latest chemical interventions. Okay, but do some of these resonate with you in terms of your own sports experience or your esports experience? Because if you don't talk to me, then this becomes the most boring conversation in the world. Yeah, just talk.
Yeah, I think one thing that's pretty common in esports is the use of recording devices or programs, apps.
Yeah, so you're able to record the movements, the gameplay.
Recording the gameplay and going over it after the match or
right.
session.
Yeah, and I've heard this, and I guess I get one of the things that's interesting is, do you in esports measure the gameplay? Do you talk about things like velocity or how? Yeah.
Some things particularly to esports is APM, actions per minute, when you clicks per minute. So use of measurements for how quick you're reacting to stuff and things.
Right. So clicks per minute, and is that an indicator of your cognitive effort, or is it an indicator of just how fast you can? Do you have to click fast just to achieve a certain outcome?
Well, that's just my opinion, but it's not that much. Of course, you have to have the cognitive awareness of what you are clicking on, but you also, it's not that important to click fast. Anybody can click fast, but you have to know what to click.
Yeah. So it's just the person who's clicking fast is perceiving a lot of stuff and able to make decisions quickly. Is that reasonable to say, or what?
Yeah, very much.
Okay. But are other people, what should I say? Do you get tired? And when you get tired in a match, what gets tired? Is it just fatigue mental, or can you actually get tired in your hands or in your neck or shoulders or things like that? Anybody? Did I lose you? Did we freeze? No.
I often get tired in my neck and back, but that's probably because of a bad positioning throughout these sessions and all that. But
Right.
mostly when I play and train, I get a headache, or not a headache, but it feels like a headache. My head is tired. I cannot think like I am thinking when I'm awake and have the power and everything.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say when I have the power, because that, you don't think of a esport as something where you need power, but I understand what you're saying. You feel energetic, I guess.
Yeah.
No, so and this is the conversation, guys, that I want, and I'm guys is a gender neutral term for me, just so we're clear. That I want us to have is I want us to make these connections and parallels, and my world is this sports world. It's not the esports world, and so I'll be the first to admit that. So you have to inform the conversation with your translation and understanding of what you feel and what's going on in the esports world. Now, of course, I'm trying to learn, and I'm bringing in some expertise on that. But they're different. And then we're going to talk a bit about, I think, what is one of the issues is that if you want to be a good esport athlete, you also need to be a reasonably good regular athlete in the sense that you're fit, because physical fitness seems to carry over into better cognitive endurance and just being able to hold out, is if you have a reasonably good fitness baseline that seems to have a positive impact on really tough cognitive load. We've seen, like people like our chess world champion and so forth that would say that physical activity is very important for being able to do these things. And doctors and many, creatives and high performance people will say that they need physical activity in order to function well under the stress of whatever it is they're doing, the concert or the surgery or so forth. So I think that's some of the other things we want to get into is how do we find that balance and do enough training on the esports side, but also do some training that's more connecting body and brain and making sure body is able to tolerate and help the brain stay, powerful, as that term was used by, what is it, Eira Jørn or Ira?
It's Jørn.
Or you just say Jørn?
That's
Yeah.
my surname.
You don't say the, okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to get into some of this stuff, okay? But now we're going to take a little break, and you guys come back in, let's say, 10 minutes, okay?
Yep.
All right. Hey, Dennis, Steven Seiler. Hey, Okay, can you guys hear me? Yeah. Well, I managed to, during the break, I managed to guide a Brink delivery truck to me. They were lost, but they were delivering a technology. They were delivering, I'll stop the share for a minute. They were delivering a shirt that I use, that it's a wearable. Let's see if I can get it in the screen, that measures breathing. So when the athlete wears the shirt, it measures their breathing frequency and the volume that they're breathing, or indirectly through a sensitive sensor that stretches, of course, with the movement, and then the data goes into a pod and da 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 da. So just another example of that I'm constantly working with these companies on this issue of how do we measure various physiological things during training. So if we go back to the slide part, share. So we're not going to talk too much about this, but pretty much now you can put a sensor anywhere. These up. Are you hearing me now?
I can hear you now.
Yeah. It seemed to, it quit. Don't see. Yeah, but we seem to be back. All right. So you can put various sensors that will track movement, acceleration, change. Acceleration just means any change in velocity. So anytime that a racket or a hand or anything moves, it'll detect the rate of change of movement, and then you can calculate velocities and so forth. So you can put these sensors just about on anything now. And you could, in theory, you could put them on yourself during gameplay, if you wanted to try to see how you're using your hands or whatever. And then you can, of course, the old days, in fact, this guy was like one of my inspirations for studying sports science was a guy named Gideon Ariel, but it wasn't biomechanics I ended up doing, it was physiology. But nowadays we're using, an iPad as a camera to take video during practices, during movement. And then I can go straight to the athlete after they've done a movement and show them what they just did and then make adjustments. So it's what you've done is you speed up the feedback so that the athlete is getting more immediate feedback on what did I just do? How did it feel? And then what did it look like? And that was much more difficult years ago. When I was a rower, the coach would be in a boat beside us, and it was super modern technology that he had a big camera and he was taking video. And then we would finish a workout and go into the clubhouse and put the VCR in and look at the video. But that was maybe an hour later. So the immediacy, the immediate feedback was not possible, but it is today. But what I do the most, I'm just going to fill this out, is I spend a lot of time on this, what I might call this triad, which is I work with endurance athletes who are trying to improve their performance. They're training a lot. And I'm interested in how do I give them the appropriate feedback. And we talk about a triangulation method where we want to measure the actual performance in some way, the power they're producing or the speed they're running at. A parallel in esport might be this actions per minute type of, or clicks per minute type of output, maybe, I'm not sure. And then we want to relate it to the cost of doing that. And obviously in cycling or running, you can imagine there's a physiological cost. It's pretty easy to measure. You can measure heart rate, you can measure blood lactate, you could measure oxygen consumption, you can measure breathing, like the shirt that I'm using. So you can measure the physiological output or the physiological cost associated with doing a certain external work. And then, of course, you can also just ask people how they feel. You can measure what we call perceived exertion, or in Norwegian, selvopplevd anstrengelse, right? And there's different scales for that. The Borg scale was developed by Gunnar Borg from Sweden, that goes 6 to 20, which sounds weird, but it was designed kind of to track heart rate from 60 to 200. So that's where those original numbers come from. But the idea of all of this is that during training, if we calibrate these against each other, then we start to get a feeling for and can give feedback on how the athlete is responding. Is this relationship changing? Are they getting tired? Is it starting to cost more and more to do the same rate of work, the same pace or power? And you could imagine maybe in an esports competition, you might see that an athlete is their heart rate's going up. You know, they're at the same rate of work. They're at the same, but they're getting more and more stressed. They're fatiguing mentally, perhaps, or the stress of the situation that they broke. They're in the later rounds of competition, and they're getting closer and closer to winning. Maybe that we're seeing that the stress levels are higher. So there's different parallels you might see in terms of there has to be some measurement of actual output. And then you can say, what is that output costing psychologically or cognitively and physiologically? So the things that we're going to be talking about in this course will be issues related to, okay, if I want to get in shape and I want to use heart rate, what are the issues? How should I measure heart rate? Are there better and worse technologies? Does it matter? Does it matter which of these watches I use or devices that I use? I've got different ones myself. So we're going to talk about validity, which just means, does the device or does the technology measure what it says it's measuring in an accurate way? Is it reliable? Reliability and validity, you really have to have both, or else there's not much point. But reliable means just, is it repeatable? Is 50, a heart rate of 50 today, also going to be measured 50 tomorrow, if it really is 50? Or is it noisy and messy and 45 one day and 55 the next? Well, then it's not reliable. Okay. So validity and reliability are fundamental measurement issues. Are we measuring what we think we're measuring? And is it consistent? Whether it's a weighing scale or a heart rate monitor or blood lactate or whatever, validity and reliability has to be there. But then we also have to have a layer of functionality. It's one thing that things work under the most perfect conditions, but does the measurement work when it's not perfect? Is it functional? Is it easy to use? You know, if I'm going to use a new technology, like let's say this shirt on cyclists, which we have and we are doing, UNO-X professional cycling team. Well, what are some issues that you might imagine could be problematic just off the top of your head? If you're going to, I'm saying, I want you guys to wear this shirt when you train and you're a professional cycling team. Anybody think of any immediate issues? Well, it's hot. And so, and they have to always be wearing their professional sponsor gear. So that means they're going to have to wear this shirt under that. And in July, right now, down in Spain, where it's 35 degrees C, that's not going to be very popular because they're doing everything in their power to wear less and to wear thinner things that get rid of heat and sweat and so forth. So that's a functional issue, is the technology, you don't want it to get in their way or interfere. And then, of course, another issue would be that they're already pushing a bunch of buttons every ride. They're already got a heart rate monitor and they've got a GPS system that, you know, and their power output and their Garmin system, So that you don't want them to have too many things to have to deal with, because then they just get pissed off. So functionality, usability, integration. Does it integrate? Can we connect it to what we're already using so that we don't have too many different buttons and devices to push? That's an issue when we're doing these kinds of monitoring technologies. All right. And then the fourth thing that we'll talk a lot about is, well, does it help? Because if that shirt that I'm putting on these athletes isn't telling the coach something they didn't know, and helping them do a better job of making adjustments in the training, then it does, what's the point, right? So the technology should solve a problem that the team or the athlete has. If it's not, then it's just extra stuff to do. And so that's useless. That's just waste of time and money. But often athletes will, or people will buy this stuff just because it seems like it could be a good idea, but they're really not getting anything out of it. Okay. So part of my job as a specialist on this stuff is to help them stay critical, help athletes and coaches say, wait a minute, this isn't really helping. Get rid of it. Keep it simple. Keep it simple, athlete. And so we'll talk about these issues as well. All right. More is not better. Questions about that? Okay. So I'm going to show you one of the things I did during this week, or last week actually, in preparation for this course, is that I have a Twitter account, and I've got about 21,000 followers, which is, I know, not very many, but it's enough that I have it's kind of like a user group or a focus group where I ask questions, I present things, we talk about research and training. It's an endurance oriented, I work with rowing and cycling and running and triathlon and so forth. But what I did last week was I generated a survey using Google Forms, and I didn't have any intention to publish it in a journal, so I didn't go through a bunch of ethics issues or anything. I just asked people 12 questions. I left it open for about a week, 4 or 5 days, and I got 1,134 responses from athletes, all over the world, males and females. So I put that on I put some of the results on a little PowerPoint, and it's in on Canvas, and you can look at it, but I'm going to show you some of it now if I can. So first I'm going to find it, but I just want you to get an idea of how athletes are using these different technologies, or how much they're using these technologies. So let's see if I can find this. Bear with me here. Oh, yeah. Forgot where I put it. Just one moment, it's coming up, and then I will share my screen. So this is, again, this is data we can talk about, we can also talk about how it was collected and the challenges of this kind of thing. But what I did is made a survey in Google Forms. Has anybody ever used Google Forms? It's just a free software that you can use to create questionnaires. You guys could easily use it during your studies. And you can generate questions that are both multiple choice, where they can check off boxes of everything that applies, or they can write a number, or they can respond to one of 5 categories, just however you want to organize the questions. And so when you're doing surveys with athletes or coaches, you try to create short surveys and get as much information in a short number of questions. And they were able to complete this in about 3 minutes, probably. And therefore I was able to get some decent responses. Initially, the first 50 or so were almost all guys. So then I put out a plea on Twitter and said, hey, I need women to answer this question too. And fortunately, there were people who started retweeting to different female sports groups and athletes and so forth. And it ended up being a pretty good distribution, a much better gender in terms of evenness of the sample, much more even than Twitter actually is, because Twitter is about 70% men, 30% women. just as a starting point. And then males tend to respond to stuff more than females, so it ends up often being even more biased. But we managed to overcome that. And so here's what you see. This is athletes, you know, they're a bit older on the male side. Training hours pretty much similar. A little bit skewed, or probably there was a rowing, some masters rowers for women that got into the group, or elite rowers maybe, I'm not sure, because it seems like I also got a lot of high performance female athletes that answered. So 67 women who categorize themselves as professional or international elite responded to the survey versus only 18 guys. So this is your, you know, you break them down. You can break them down into what sport they do and their level of performance, which I gave 6 categories: recreational, age group. So I would fall into that at 57, but still competing. High school based on age, and then you just the typical categories. You're a senior level, meaning you're over 21 or 23 actually. You're over the U23, but you are a regional standard, or you're a national standard, or maybe you have a college scholarship in the UK or USA or so, or you're a senior international elite. So these are typical kind of categorizations, and you see it's a mix. But most people are not elite, and that's how it should be. Most are represented in this area here. So just as an example of how technology has become fairly pervasive in some of these feedback technologies, you see, I asked, do you use a digital training diary, something like Training Peaks or Strava? Some of you, I don't know how many of you have heard of these different ones, but there's a bunch of them, but Strava and Training Peaks are two of the big ones. 84% of the men said, yep, actively and regularly. And I can say that being one of these people, these guys, they are so often, if it's not on their training diary, it's like it didn't happen. They can't even conceive of doing a training session and not having it recorded in some way. So that's kind of become the mentality. And but women are also using them. It's not quite as high use rate among females. And then a very small percentage say, nope, I'm not doing any kind of, I'm just, you know, I'm low tech, no tech when it comes to my training. That is a very small percentage. And then there's a few that, you know, I'm one of these that my data goes into Strava, but I don't look at Strava, but I do look at my data in some other tools, but it's just passively, it's going to Strava just because I needed it to go there because I was testing out some other technology. So there's some of those. All right. And then I asked, do you use a heart rate monitor when you're training? Okay. And here you see 88% of guys say, yep, almost always. So almost every workout. And I would be one of those. Every time I get on the bike, I turn on my heart rate monitor and I get that data uploaded. So I have a full record of that, and I use it for some analytics for that triangle that I was talking about. A little bit lower use rate on the female side, but females tend to be more nuanced, and they tend to go more on feel, which may be a good thing actually. So we see this was kind of what I expected. Having been doing this for many years, I expected that the females were using these technologies a bit less. And then here's a bunch of other stuff that we just put as a kind of a so-called smørbrødsliste, and said, well, are you using, you know, like GPS, meaning you're using a Garmin or a watch that's got a GPS? A big percentage of men are using power output. Now, if you're a runner, you're probably not going to use power, but if you're a cyclist, you're going to use power. If you're a rower, you may be using power output. Are you using lactate measurements? Are you using heart rate variability? Now, this was perhaps one of the most surprising. There's over 40% of the males in this sample said they were using something called heart rate variability, which we're going to talk about. We're going to have a guest speaker that has created an app that you guys could use yourself with your smartphone to measure heart rate variability as an indicator of how stressed your body is. Are you in a parasympathetic, meaning relaxed rate? Are you high stressed? Are you sleeping well? And so forth. This has become very popular, I would say. And then there's some more marginal technologies, new, like this ventilation I'm testing now is very new, so there's very few people using it, and so forth. Do you actually go to a laboratory? Well, most of these are professionals. There's not too many amateurs doing lab testing, but there are some. So this gives you an idea that there's a lot of technologies, and most people are using something. I think there was, let's see if I can get out of the way here. This, let's see, it's right in my way. Yeah, so no, here's what you see for no technology used. So very small percentages that are not using anything, okay? All right, so this is an idea. And then the final thing I'll show you here on this survey I did was just this, is how would you describe your relationship to all these training numbers? And almost half of the males said that they're essentially addicted to the data. If they don't have the data on their workout, it's almost like it didn't happen. And about a fourth of females will say the same. And then another half or so, most say, I do find some tools useful, but I don't depend on them. That probably is a healthier way to be. And then there's a few very passive where the data is getting collected, but they're not even really, they don't care. The coach is just kind of interpreting and telling them what it means. This is probably, I would say, this is very inconsistent with the Norwegian model, where we want the athlete to be engaged in the center of their own, they becoming connected to their own training and understand it. We don't want our athletes to be passive and just say, well, I don't know how I feel, the coach has to tell me. But there are athletes like that still. So this gives you an idea of the ecosystem that I work with, and they are becoming just more and more connected to their various monitoring technologies. And so part of my job is to try to make sense of that and help make sure that it doesn't go too far, and that they're using these tools appropriately and getting the most out of them. Now, what I would ask you guys just is to say, what are you using anything like this? How many of you use some kind of either a regular tools like this, or you're using an esport type training calendar? Anybody doing that?
Are you talking about esports or just regular exercising?
Well, both.
Yeah, I use Strava.
Okay. Running?
Running, yes.
Okay. Others? But when you use Strava, Thomas, how do you use it?
Well, I actually wrote my master's thesis on the app 5 years ago. So it started then as a kind of way of looking into the motivational aspects of the app.
Yeah.
But for me, myself, I just use it to record my sessions and keep track of my pace and stuff when I'm running, so I can adjust it to keep the intensity at the right level.
Okay. So you don't just use it to go after Strava segments or
to be honest, that doesn't matter at all for me. I have some friends, but I have not like reached out to any other than my closest friends, sharing the routes and stuff. So it's just for tracking for me.
Yeah. Well, then you use it, you might say, in a healthy way. But I do know of people, even guys my age, that just when they first started using Strava, it became an obsession.
I know I know a lot of people that say the same thing, and my friends too. I was off Strava for a couple of months now. I just wasn't running that much, and they all ask me where I've been and if everything's okay with me. And because every time they do something, they record it and publish it and want feedback. Yeah.
Right. Well, I got a very silent crowd here, a small crowd and a very quiet crowd. I don't even know if you're awake, you guys. So you're not helping me out much. But are any of you others using any kind of tools like this for training? We got if it's going to be a long day if we don't ever talk.
I mean, I review my stats after a Halo game, but I don't really use any measurements stuff. I'm not a professional player, so I never had the use for it. But yeah, so I
All right,
don't really
well,
use anything.
let's dig into that. So stats after a Halo game. So what are the what kind of stats do you get?
You get like accuracy. You get like how much you died, how much you killed, and you have, all of this is available like on a website. So at any time you can see like your summarized stats. And I think that's very common for a lot of different uh, games because it's all data.
Yeah.
So if they
Right.
have the tools for it, you can like review a lot of different type of data.
Right. And that's my understanding is that there is because it's all data to begin with, it's very easy to get a fairly good report of your gameplay.
Yeah,
I'm not
sure.
in terms of outcomes like kills and so forth, but I guess there's also, are there outcomes or output data like your movement speed or clicks per minute, or are there other kinds of variables that you're getting that say something about the intensity of your effort or or your ability to maintain a high intensity longer in gameplay?
Not like from the get-go, but I'm sure there are third-party apps. I know for like CS, 100%, which is Counter-Strike.
Yeah.
But I there is a lot of possibility in order to like record this types of stuff. But from the website I use, yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe you're able to like put together some algorithm based on the stats you're getting and record intensity in that way, but not really from what I'm aware of at this point.
Okay. Because one of the things I'm going to challenge you guys on is this idea of these parallels, because what I see as a sports scientist is that basically every characteristic I see from the history of sport and how sport training has developed, how sports, even everything about it, the professionalization of sport, I see all of the same features in esport, but they're just happening faster. You know what I mean? The sport is evolving faster than the sport. What took 100 years in sport is taking 30, 25 in esport. So I think pretty much any parallel that I talk about in terms of training monitoring, race analysis, competition analysis, team sports, it's all either already happening in esport or it will. Even professional league and salary caps or whatever, the all of these issues, the teams will form, or the players will form unions. That'll come. It hasn't maybe yet in esport, but it will. So I think pretty much esport athletes can basically look to sports and just say, all right, what's going to happen? Because it's just going to happen quicker in your evolution. So from that standpoint, then I am very sure that training analytics and race analytics or competition analytics will be and is already a super important part of esport, and maybe even more important because everything there's a digital track, there's a digital spoor of every click you make. If you want, if the developer wants there to be. Does that make sense? And your frequency, because we're going to talk a bit about this, is, one of the things when it comes to feedback is the frequency of the data. How high frequency of data input do you need to capture important information? in the play. You know, is it once a second? Is it 10 times a second, 10 hertz? Is it 20 hertz? Are you with me? So depending on what we're measuring, if I'm measuring speed in a marathon or a runner, then it's probably okay that I'm getting an update every second from my device. That's probably accurate enough. But if I'm measuring movement on a football pitch, 1 second accuracy or 1 second frequency would be way too slow. We'd be missing lots of accelerations and movements within that space, right? Well, my understanding is that in the esports environment, the frequency is essentially unlimited. I mean, we're talking, you know, maybe 1,000 hertz or something on the frequency of data capture. Does that make sense? So you're pretty much unlimited on gameplay analytics and capturing every movement that happened, every click or whatever. That's not the case in sports analytics at the moment. We don't have that degree of you know, you just the power of the frequency of data capture because of various issues out in the field and GPS and all these things is more challenging. So we will get into some of that. And one of the things I will be doing, you will be getting, in a couple of weeks, you'll get your first kind of a task, which is part of a mappa evaluering in Norwegian, a kind of a accumulation of some tasks. And I don't want these to be kind of perceived as wasted efforts or whatever. We want to dig into some relevant questions and like issues like what are the parallels between sport analytics and e-sport analytics, and where, you know, what can we learn? Or if we're going to measure heart rate, what is the best current device for doing so? What does the data say from research, and which measure types are more reliable and usable? I want you to dig in, and I'm going to ask you specific questions, and I'm going to have you go into various kinds of the literature and what you can find and make some assessments. If you were, you know, if you were in charge of a team or a group of athletes, esport athletes, and you were told you're in charge of deciding which of these tools we're going to use and which brand of this tool, whether it's heart rate variability or a nutrition app, how would you decide that, right? Because that's the kind of jobs that will be going out. You know, the coach or the manager of a team, that's one of their jobs, is to make decisions regarding what tools do I use and do I ask my athletes to use in order to monitor their process, in order to have good, you might call it business analytics. You know, any organization needs to have knowledge about how their organization is functioning, right? Or else they die. You know, they've got to have real-time analytics of what is happening. And so that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at, is how do we make some decisions? How do you, as either the athlete or the coach or the manager, whatever role you end up in, how do you make good decisions on behalf of those who you are responsible for? So those will be the kinds of tasks that I will ask you to do and prepare small write-ups on. Okay, so you know that that's coming, and also I will be asking you to write good sentences. You know, because one of the things you're going to find out, folks, is no matter how you get around it, you still need to communicate with good sentences, with good, clear reports. They don't often in a business sits, you don't get paid extra for writing more, but you work your way up because the reports you provide are clear. They are concise, they're well worded, and we get the bottom line. Because if you're operating where you have people above you and you're providing them with information, then your goal is for them to read and say, ah, this makes sense. I get it. I understand what this person wrote. So that's a skill that in any field of endeavor, it still pays to be able to take information, digest it, make sense of it, and interpret it and write good sentences. And that's not always a skill that Norwegian education is focusing enough on. But trust me, it's still important out in the, in a job market. So we'll do a little bit of that. Okay. Don't get intimidated by it, but it's a skill that you need to develop and apply it to hopefully something you think is kind of interesting. And then there will be a final exam, and it'll just be a kind of a short answer multiple choice exam based on the pensum, based on articles that these guest speakers have provided me and said, I'm identifying this as a part of the pensum. Okay. They don't know what that word means, but I use syllabus for them, or required readings. Okay. And those will form the material that you will be responsible for on the final exam. So those are the two ways that you will be evaluated, is these three tasks. There will be kind of evaluations, short reports on some particular technology. I'm waiting a little bit on the exact assignment because I want it to be influenced by the guest speakers. That's why I'm populating. You'll notice that if you go into Canvas, you'll see that it's populating. So you see material for me already. You see material for Sam Impey, who will be next week's speaker on. He's a sports scientist, nutrition guy who's developed his own app on nutrition monitoring. So he'll be speaking to you, and he's already given me articles that will be pensum. And so that I'll just keep populating, but I'm giving them time to fill out. So they're coming. All right. So if you've looked at Canvas, you'll see that it's organizing. It's like an organism that's slowly growing various organs. And so, but it's filling out. But it's filling out with material from the various speakers. Any questions on that? Are there questions on the course or how my approach? This is an experiment, guys. We're learning as we go. My intentions. If you have questions, you can send me an email. It's best to send me an email because that's the communications channel that I use most actively. And that is just my name, Stephen, as you see it on the channel, Stephen.Seiler. Not the carry is not part of it. So Stephen.Seiler and then at uial.no. All right. So if you have a question about the course, about guest speakers, about pensum and so forth, that's where I would like you to send it. All right. And you can also, well, it's not really an option for most of you, but you're always welcome to visit my office. But the best way to communicate with me will be via email. Okay. Any other questions for right now? All right. Well, I don't know if you know these other people, but I hope they will show up soon. It's a small group. So maybe they decided that they'll wait until the really fun speakers show up and with the guest speakers and they'll kick in next week. But I will see you next week. I will also be online when Dr. Impey speaks. So it'll be hopefully a good conversation. All right. I don't know what time it is, but it doesn't matter to me. If we're done, we're done. So I will always start on time, guys. But if we finish early, we finish early. That's fine for me. All right. All right, guys. Take care. And I will see you next time, next Tuesday.